Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munzer, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then you're a bit late. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. This week, we have reached the final episode, the conclusion of our 7th series exploring the evolution of alien, sci-fi and cosmic horror. What an incredible 30 weeks it's been. We started this series way back in the spring of 2021. And we've come a long way since then. So what we're going to be doing this week is just having a little look back at the series and some of the highlights. Mary Wild is going to drop in for a little discussion as we look back on the series. And I'm going to be reading and responding to some audience feedback and finishing the episode by counting down the listeners' and my top 10 alien, sci-fi and cosmic horror movies of all time. So thank you so much to all of you who sent me your feedback, your top 10 lists in your droves over the last few weeks. We've collated all of that information and put it all together. So we will be revealing some of your favourites and your top 10s later on in the episode. First of all, just a quick announcement to say that as this is the last episode in the series, we're going to be taking a little hiatus. We are going to be off the air on the main feed for a couple of months. But we'll be kicking off Series 8 of the podcast in the springtime, so in a few months' time. And if you stay tuned to the very end of this episode, I will reveal and talk a little bit about which subgenre we are going to be exploring in Season 8. But in the meantime, if you want to continue listening to Evolution of Horror content, then you can. You just need to sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/evolution of horror. If you sign up at a $5 level, you will continue getting regular episodes. You'll get at least 2 episodes per month in which we cover new releases, or we respond to mailbag questions, or we just simply discuss a movie as voted for by patrons. But you can also sign up at a $10 level, which means that you will get access to a new episode every single week. So it will be like the podcast never went away. You'll get access to our exclusive Patreon mini-seasons for $10 per month as well. So you'll be able to listen to our Legends of Horror season, which we've just kicked off. Episode 1 of that aired this week, in which me and James Swanton discussed the life and career of Vincent Price, and then discussed one of his greatest performances in Theatre of Blood. So that's one of the many, many bonus episodes that you will be able to listen to if you sign up to our Patreon. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, let's kick off this week's episode by having a little look back at what we've learnt over the last 30 weeks as we conclude our series on the evolution of alien horror.
You could go outside tonight, if it's a nice clear night, lie down in your back garden or on your balcony and look up, and there's just infinity hovering over your head. We don't know what's there. Mm-hmm. We've made so many advances, but honestly, we have absolutely no idea what's out there.
Is there anything more frightening, exciting, exhilarating, awe-inspiring and nightmare-inducing than space?
2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff.
It's big, it's cold, it's dark, it's filled with wonders and horrors that we couldn't possibly conceive.
I'm never going to space. I don't even go in the sea, Mike. I'm not going to fucking space.
Just trying to grapple with the idea of our universe, its size and scope, and what might lie beyond it, is almost too much for our brains to take.
When I start to think about it, sometimes I freak myself out. I start to get a little bit,
If I think too hard about the universe, especially if I've had a drink, I can feel like a panic attack coming along. It's kind of... Space is kind of like death to me. Like it's the complete unknowable.
So it's no wonder that cosmic and alien horror has remained one of the most creative, innovative and popular subgenres of horror. Unlike vampires, ghosts, werewolves or zombies, there's a distinct possibility, even a probability, that aliens actually exist. But we have no idea what they look like or how malevolent they might be.
It's plausible, but it's also not restrictive in the sense that we have absolutely no idea what might be out there. So anything is possible. And like one of the great things about horror that I always say is it's kind of the place of the unfettered imagination. And so with aliens, you can just basically make up anything and it's kind of plausible, but it's also incredibly unpredictable.
As far as we know, human beings didn't even begin telling stories about aliens from other planets invading Earth until the last couple of 100 years.
There had been a few other stories about contact with alien beings or alien civilizations. But if you then go and look at them, you know, they're in the mode actually of Gulliver's Travels. They are utopian stories or stories of encounters with angels. They could as easily take place on lost continents or in supernatural or magical realms. They just happen to say this is the moon or this is Mars.
In fact, one of the earliest examples of alien fiction actually occurred in the late 19th century and is still in many ways considered the quintessential alien text, H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds.
It may actually be the first. I mean, I never ever say that because somebody will find some Portuguese pamphlet from 1870 that has. But it seems that Wells was the first to conceive of a large-scale attack from another planet.
War of the Worlds sparked an interest and intrigue in the idea of hostile life forms from other planets, mainly Mars. But why Mars?
Well, I think there's two main reasons for this. The prosaic one is that it's the nearest planet. The other one, of course, is that it's the red planet.
It's red, right? It's so evocative, isn't it? Yeah.
It's evocative, and particularly in the 1950s, in America, red meant one thing and one thing only. It was those damn commies and they were on Mars.
Of course, the dictionary definition of alien is a foreigner, one who is not a naturalized citizen of the place that he or she lives. Simply put, the alien is the ultimate other and has been used to represent the other in some form or another ever since War of the Worlds.
There is a whole speech about how the Martians are doing to us what we did to the Tasmanians.
Yes.
It's like, it's not something, it's plainly embedded in the story.
Despite the popularity of War of the Worlds as a novel, it took 50 years for sci-fi and alien horror to really take off as a subgenre in cinema. The first boom of alien sci-fi and cosmic horror occurred in the 1950s.
Panic that sweeps around the globe as the great masses of mankind flee blindly in a headlong stampede of hysteria.
After the success of George Pal's War of the Worlds adaptation in 1953, alien movies were invading cinemas everywhere.
They come from another world, spawned in the light years of space, unleashed to take over the bodies and souls of the people of our planet.
So yeah, there are some great films from the 1950s. There's an awful lot of trash, but isn't that true of any era, to be honest?
As is typical with the horror genre, most alien invasion monster movies weren't generally highly regarded by critics. Most of them were categorized as B-movies, played as part of double bills in drive-in movie theaters. Put simply, they were usually pretty cheap and cheerful.
Beware of the blob, it creeps.
This is very much low budget, made in a different way, kind of outside the traditional old Hollywood studio system, just made differently for a different audience and targeting those kind of B-movie double feature experiences.
Meanwhile, over in the UK, Hammer Studios were creating their own kinds of alien monster movies.
Cordon around the entire area, evacuate all public, get information to check up every movement that's likely to take place inside this radius tonight. Yes, sir?
It's more low-key.
Yeah.
It's more ideas-based.
Yes.
I find the films of this period, coming from Britain, to be particularly delightful as a record of that very quintessentially British way of reacting to a crisis or a peril. Yes. Whenever the aliens invade, we go to the pub.
In Britain, sci-fi horror was proving to be particularly popular on the small screen, with the Quatermass TV shows terrifying audiences in their living rooms around the country. and a show that began in the early 60s, which would become one of the longest running and most beloved television shows ever made.
You know, it was that program that introduced so many people, like me, to science fiction.
Yeah.
You know, we were little. We didn't notice the wobbly sets. We didn't notice how bad the effects were. We didn't care.
But in the 60s and early 70s in Hollywood, audiences were less interested in aliens from outer space and were becoming more scared and intrigued by a new kind of human horror made popular by Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Serial killers, Satanists, and cults were proving to be the new in thing in horror. In fact, the sexual revolution and boom in counterculture of the late 60s meant that aliens were actually becoming more relatable. A whole generation started rejecting the idea of conforming and embracing their otherness. And as such, the alien started becoming somewhat empowering.
I'm just a sweet transvestite.
There is something generally kind of transgressive and subversive at its core that you can never take away from it and never stops being fascinating and joyful and exciting.
But by the end of the 1970s, aliens and space were about to come back in a big way. The success of films like Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, not to mention advances in practical effects and a new generation of filmmakers who had grown up on the 50s classics, all resulted in an incredible new wave of alien movies, the likes of which we hadn't seen before. Even straight-up remakes of the 50s classics like Invasion of the Body Snatchers felt like something entirely new.
It's a very powerful movie. It just so well conveys the inevitability of everything and just being at the mercy of forces that are so much larger than you. Like, it's such a cynical, bleak worldview, but it's very 70s American politics.
But it was a little movie in 1979, directed by Ridley Scott, from a script written by Dan O'Bannon based on his love of 50s sci-fi horror films, that really breathed new life into the subgenre and changed horror forever.
Dallas?
The thing about Alien is that on paper, it's no less of a B-movie than many of the 50s classics. It's just really, really well made.
It doesn't do anything, you know, as outside the box as you might think it did by its reputation. It just did what it did very well. And what it did was cowboy truckers meet space straws.
Aha! Yes! Yes! And thanks to artist H.R. Giger, Alien also introduced us to one of the scariest monsters in horror history.
It's like the thing you wouldn't want to find in your Airbnb. It's like the thing you're really frightened when you turn the lights on in the kitchen has just disappeared under the table. It's like a rat mouse.
Oh, don't touch it! Don't touch it!
But it's not just the xenomorph that makes Ridley Scott's classic so scary. What about the fact that our characters are floating around in a dark, giant tin can with the cold, dark vacuum of space just inches away? If somebody offered you a ticket to space, like a commercial airliner, would you go, do you think?
No. That is one of the things I remember saying to my mom, and my mom remembers me saying very clearly, because we were studying space in school at, grade 5 or 4 or something. And I was saying to my mom, like, I don't want to go to space. And she's like, you don't have to. And I was like, but I really don't want to. And,
Many horror movies we've covered this season don't even need alien creatures to be absolutely terrifying.
Ship doesn't really go faster than light. What it does is it creates a dimensional gateway that allows it to jump instantaneously from one point of the universe to another light years away.
In fact, after the success of Alien, the subgenre branched off into two specific directions. One that involved aliens, but the other about something bigger and more existential.
I have such wonderful things to show you.
Oh my God!
And that really kind of underpins so much of what like Lovecraftian horror is and cosmic horror is this idea that it's something so unknowable that like the human brain just can't even comprehend it, and so will often just pop.
Cosmic horror and Lovecraftian horror introduces an entirely new kind of indescribable monster.
Something in the mist! Shut the doors! Shut the doors!
I realised with fresh horror that new doors of perception were opening up inside. New? Not so. Old doors of perception. The perception of a child who has not yet learned to protect itself by developing the tunnel vision that keeps out 99% of the universe. Terror is the widening of perspective and perception. The horror was in knowing I was swimming down to a place that most of us leave when we get out of diapers and into training pants.
But returning to the late 70s and early 80s, movies like Invasion of the Body Snatchers and Alien were accompanied by a huge wave of other low-budget sci-fi horror films, like Phantasm and Extro.
Extro has returned.
Some of the imagery in this is fucking terrifying. The actual, you know, the famous bit of footage, which we'll talk about a bit more of, the extra that you see on the side of the road in the sort of crab position.
Yeah.
That was bored into my mind, and I had visions of that constantly. And that went in the early days of YouTube. That showed up on YouTube as a sort of real, quote unquote, real alien footage, because it is just so uncanny and scary and weird.
But there were some movies in this wave that would go on to eventually be considered some of the greatest movies ever made, like John Carpenter's The Thing. What's your favourite sci-fi horror movie?
Oh god, The Thing is a real big cop-out, isn't it? But
I mean, it's going to be a cliched answer, but it's got to be The Thing.
It's The Thing, especially after the last 2 years we've had. I think it's all the more relevant now. It's an absolute lockdown banger.
It is just absolutely what the fuck. You have never seen anything like it before.
Philip Kaufman's Invasion of the Body Snatchers, John Carpenter's The Thing, and Ridley Scott's Alien were 50s B-movies made as A-movies. These were masterpieces made by filmmakers inspired by the movies they grew up on.
You gotta be fucking kidding.
You know, if I did a top 10 movies of all time, then Aliens and The Thing would be on there.
That's it, man. Game over, man. Game over.
7 years after the groundbreaking Alien came its sequel, James Cameron's Aliens. But James Cameron's Aliens did something different to the original. It blended horror and sci-fi with action. And suddenly, in the late 80s and into the 90s, alien movies were slipping into more mainstream territory, blending with action and spectacle.
One ugly motherfucker.
We had Vietnam War movies with aliens.
It has something in common with those original cave paintings, which were kind of warning people against something with teeth coming out of the jungle to get us. The Predator is kind of a bunch of really ancient fears rolled into one. And I think that's maybe why pretty much everyone who watches it loves it.
FBI cop movies with aliens.
I want this car.
Jonathan Miller would never do anything to break the law.
Bye.
This is a film in which an alien leaps from the body of a dead stripper into a dog. And I didn't think I'd ever say that sentence.
And by the mid-90s, with advances in visual effects, alien invasion movies were no longer cult midnight movies, but full-blown blockbuster juggernauts.
Welcome to Earth. It is just sort of good triumphing over evil, and everybody, the good people seem really good.
Even the president is so nice.
Exactly, yeah.
But soon the pendulum swung back the other way. The optimistic 90s gave way to the nihilistic 2000s. After 9/11, stories about outsiders invading American soil became truly frightening again, and more visceral than we'd ever seen before.
It is shot for shot 9/11, like the dust falling, the people wandering around like zombies, almost shell-shocked.
There's something about the sort of lack of quality of the filming of it that makes it seem more real. If it was really sort of glossy and kind of filmed in that Hollywood style, you'd just be like, yeah, I've seen this kind of quite a lot. And I think that's one of the things that makes this film sort of stand apart from those disaster-style movies.
What kind of alien would invade some shitty council estate in South London?
One that's looking for a fight.
But by the end of the 2000s and into the 2010s, we worried less about outside threats and started looking inwards. An economic crash and increasing political and racial turmoil meant that alien stories could provide timely social commentaries.
The government then established an aid group that started to ferry the aliens to a temporary camp that was set up just beneath the ship.
What they do in the film is they kind of they make sure there's an us and them by using this different terminology of prawns or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
This is real.
Yeah.
Or this could be real.
Yeah. Right now, alien movies are still as popular as they were back in the 1950s, with high-concept alien sci-fi movies like A Quiet Place and 10 Cloverfield Lane proving to be some of the most popular of the last decade. It's a subgenre that's always going to be popular and terrifying no matter what, whether it's exploring the idea that we're truly alone in the universe or that we're not.
What's up there in all that black? I mean, what it's just sort of hovering over our heads every night, and it's quite a terrifying idea that I'm not sure what's scariest, that there's nothing there. Or that there's a lot of stuff there.
We're all scared of the unknown, and there's nothing more unknowable than space.
The vastness and the kind of unfathomable distances of the cosmos, and that's so dark, and it produces this kind of like, it conjures up an image of the void, you know, like this kind of this emptiness, this abyss out in space that we haven't explored, we haven't charted, we haven't come to grips with. And that is kind of amazing, you know, to think that there is this sublime vastness out there, but at the same time it's terrifying because we feel so small next to it.
These stories remind us that no matter how evolved, how advanced our species has become, we're still but a dot in the vast, incomprehensible, unimaginable void of space. And that's a concept that will always terrify us.
This is Ripley, last survivor of the Nostromo, signing off.
And there we go. We did it. What an incredible journey it's been. One of my absolute personal favourite subgenres to explore. I've loved making this series. And on that note, I want to say a huge thank you to every single fantastic guest who joined me for this series, because it really was all killer and no filler when it came to the guests for this series. So I would like to say a huge thank you to all of them right now. So a big thank you to Kevin Lyons, Kim Newman, Stacey Ponder, Kat Davis, Mitch and Andy from Strong Language and Violent Scenes, James Swanton, Graham Saunders, Alison Rumfit, Michael Blythe, Neil Brand, Steph McKenna, Jen Handorf, Chris Hewitt, Lucy O'Brien, Sam Ashurst, Shay Ashurst, James and Matt from Journey Through Sci-Fi, Jamie Graham, Stevie Webb, Becky Dark, Matt Glasby, Gav Murphy, Layla Latif, Alex West, Josh Tonks, Anna Bogutskaya, Rob Watts, Adam Robinson, Louise Blaine, Rihanna Dillon, Lou Thomas, Tim Coleman, Alex Ailing, Brad Hansen, and Rosie Fletcher. A huge thank you once again to all of my amazing EOH family. I couldn't have done this without you. And of course, there's one other huge thank you that I've got to give to a very special EOH collaborator who once again joined me for multiple episodes of this series to give her own unique Freudian perspective on these films. And as ever, it's been such an honour and a treat to have her involved in the podcast. So, dropping in to say hello for the last time this series, it's the one and only Mary Wilde. Hello, Mary.
Hey, Mike. How are you?
I am good. Happy New Year.
Thank you. Happy New Year to you too.
How are things? How's life?
Oh, good. Busy. Lots of work, but I'm enjoying it. Actually, I should tell you something that's related to this.
Yeah.
I'm trialing out this new gym, and they have flotation tanks, and they look like space pods, honestly.
Oh my God, I love that. I've always wanted to try one of those flotation tanks. That's so cool.
It's so trippy. Highly recommend. 10 out of 10.
I love it. Well, Mary, let me start off by asking you just a bit about your year in horror. How's 2021 been for you? And what have been some of your favourites? I seem to recall you were a big fan of Malignant, right?
Yeah, I mean, I did a top 10 for the year, and Malignant was my number one.
Amazing. Cool.
As you know, I'm a big fan of that movie. But the other two that I absolutely loved from last year were Prana Bailey Bond's wonderful film Censor.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, wow. She just arrived fully formed on the scene. Perfection. I love that movie.
Yeah.
And also Dasha Nekrosova's The Scary of 61st.
Ooh, I've not seen this.
Yeah, I'm dying to know what you think of it. It's quite controversial. Like, it's very risky and daring, but I think as her first film, as a debut, it's pretty impressive, and it's a real cinephiles movie. There's a lot of homages being paid to people, who've been trailblazers in horror.
Oh, wow. Whereabouts did you watch this, Mary? Was it at a festival?
Yeah, I saw it at the Soho Horror Film Festival.
Fantastic, yeah.
But I think it's actually going to be on Shudder.
Oh, wonderful. Amazing.
Yeah.
Shudder's getting so good at the moment. Like, it's real. Like, it feels like constantly, almost on like a weekly basis, there's really interesting new stuff dropping on there. It's great.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, well, that's good. Well, we should all keep an eye out for that then. So that's The Scary of 61st. That's one of Mary's favourites, and that's going to be on Shudder. Right, Mary, let's talk about Aliens. What an incredible journey it's been. Once again, I mean, it feels like it's been a while. The last time we actually spoke to each other on the podcast was way back at the beginning of this Aliens series, which was about 30 weeks ago, I suppose, now, which is crazy. But once again, thank you so much for all of your, I think I speak on behalf of all of the listeners too, for all of your incredible, insightful segments. I've loved listening to them from week to week. It's been amazing.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, as ever, it's such a privilege and honor to contribute to the pod. And I've really enjoyed this series, honestly. I'm a big sci-fi girl, and it kind of made me think of, do you remember even before the Alien series kicked off, there was that one viral tweet where someone said that you can have horror set in outer space?
Oh my God, I know. That was so funny, wasn't it?
It's hilarious, and I think that you've definitely proven her wrong.
I mean, just imagine that. Imagine thinking that horror can't take place in what it must be the scariest environment imaginable, right? That's what I've been thinking. Something that I found quite funny asking each one of my guests all throughout this series is, would you go to space if given the choice? And it's really funny to hear the sort of divided opinion. But so many people have just sort of said, not in a million years would I want to go into space, It's quite funny.
Gosh.
I can't remember whether I ever asked you that, Mary, but would you ever go into space given the chance?
Oh, 100% I would go. Definitely. I mean, I think I even outed myself as an alien in our previous convo.
Oh, yes, of course, yes.
as the one alien you know.
I love it. So how has it been for you? I mean, you picked a kind of handful of movies to sort of talk about this series. How was it for you kind of going through and revisiting some of these movies?
Oh, really exciting. Just because I was able to kind of look at them in a much more focused way with a set of things that I was kind of looking out for as opposed to just a casual viewing. And yeah, I love this kind of thing. I love like a real focused, dedicated study of a subgenre, which is obviously the whole concept of your podcast. And I think going back, especially like I got to discover things along the way. Like when I did my segment on Invasion of the Body Snatchers, I'd only ever seen the 1978 one. So watching the 1955 one was a real education and really eye-opening that the concerns were kind of manifesting in a different way in a previous era, you know?
Yeah, that's really interesting. What did you think of that 1955 version?
I really liked it. I thought it was effective as a horror movie. It was very unsettling. And yeah, it's kind of, I guess I really love the type of sci-fi that deals in like the question of a dystopian society where, something that becomes something that we've always taken for granted in our normal civilization, that suddenly there's like this uncanny shift and something changes forever and we have to kind of readjust. I suppose that's very relatable for all of us going through a pandemic.
Right. I think that's so true. And I do think that I can't help but rethink all of these movies when watching them post-pandemic. Do you know what I mean? As well, especially some of the more recent ones we've just covered, like 10 Cloverfield Lane and A Quiet Place, and these movies about kind of, even Signs, actually, M. Night Shyamalan Signs, but these movies of families kind of living in isolation with this kind of threat looming on the outside. Do you know what I mean? It's been really interesting looking at it through that lens, I think.
Yeah, and The Thing.
Yes, of course. Yeah, of course. Because there are connections, aren't there, between, this goes back a little bit to our sort of body horror discussions as well, but there are connections to a kind of virus or a viral entity kind of invading bodies with a lot of these alien movies, I suppose. So it does make a lot of sense that it would chime a chord with us at the moment, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely.
What's been your kind of the highlight for you, would you say then? What's been your favourite movie to revisit and explore this series?
Oh, without a doubt, Predator.
Oh my God. The amount of people that sent in comments as well talking about how much they loved your segment on that one, especially when you listed all of the weapons.
Amazing.
So good.
That was so satisfying, honestly. I mean, I'm a big Arnie fan anyway, but rewatching Predator, and of course also like covering Predator 2, which I love that sequel. Sequels don't always get it right, but this one I feel like, because it just went in such a different direction. So I felt like you were watching a different type of movie and there were links. But I guess because of the alienation connected to voyeurism is so interesting to me. And the kind of mass surveillance issue that we have to contend with at the moment as well in our modern times, with like technology and the kind of various, ethical concerns around that. And yeah, I suppose also the question of the performance of masculinity in these movies. And and I just really love how the horror trope of an alien can come in and fulfill a lot of these questions in a movie. And yeah, it gave me a new appreciation of these movies that maybe I hadn't considered before. And I just love applying psychoanalysis to them.
I know. I totally agree with you, actually. Predator was a real highlight for me as well, because I especially love sort of exploring these movies that may have a reputation as being kind of brainless action movies, or just these kind of like muscle, kind of mindless muscle films, or whatever you want to call them, right? And I think hearing your perspective on them and revisiting them, and then actually discussing them with Sam and his partner, now wife, Che, amazing. It was really fascinating to hear all of the different perspectives on that movie, and the way it kind of crosses over into different areas and different subgenres. Me and Sam had some fascinating conversations about how it's shared quite a lot with folk horror, but also kind of Italian cannibal movies, and obviously slashers, and the idea of the final girl and all of that kind of thing. I think there's a lot of really interesting elements to that film.
Yeah, there's a lot of little subtleties there, and it's the type of film that is constantly giving you gifts with rewatches, because you can constantly find new dimensions in it that you previously wouldn't have thought about. So yeah, I like that it's kind of, as you say, it's sort of it's easy to dismiss because people think it's just, cheesy 1980s action man stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not. It's much more sophisticated.
I agree. And also the different elements, I think one of the joys of this particular subgenre is how varied it is, I think, isn't it? And how, I suppose, the idea of the alien, it could literally be anything. And I've loved going from these kind of very conventional alien invasion movies like War of the Worlds or whatever into some of the weird and wonderful stuff like Event Horizon or From Beyond, and that kind of real kind of out there cosmic level stuff as well. What a joy that's been to explore.
Oh, definitely. I'm a big fan of cosmic horror, and of course I also loved covering Annihilation.
Yes.
It's wonderful. I mean, that movie is just, I swear, I every time I watch it, I feel like I've just dropped acid or something.
I know. It's unbelievable, isn't it? I'm actually really pleased that there's so much love for that film, because again, it felt like a movie that it didn't really feel like it got the praise it deserved at the time, Annihilation. But actually reading all of the feedback from people, and I'm about to read the listeners' top 10 alien movies, and Annihilation actually is in there. And I'm so glad that so many listeners of the podcast actually really embraced that movie. And again, I think a lot of people really loved hearing your perspective on that one as well. But it's a fascinating movie, isn't it?
It really is, yeah. And I like that it's very experimental. As it progresses, it gets increasingly more, kind of like daring in terms of the the stylistic elements and the filmmaking techniques. And who better than Natalie Portman really to deliver on that? She can literally do no wrong.
Incredible, absolutely incredible. Yeah, so true. What do you think the future is of this subgenre, Mary, especially right now in today's current climate? Do you think that audiences are going to continue embracing these types of movies looking to the future now?
Yeah, definitely. I think with how rapidly technology is changing, I think that always presents an opportunity to come up with new ways to tell stories about aliens, what aliens look like, but also just maybe not even necessarily an actual creature, but more of a kind of like ontological horror of alienation setting into society. What I mean by that is that we experience the world through our connections with other people, right? And that's how we feel, I guess, comforted and reassured that we're a part of something bigger than ourselves. And I suppose with the notion of aliens, this is actually a very psychoanalytic concept, alienation. Because of the unconscious, we have to accept that on some level we are aliens to ourselves. We have an awareness, but beneath that threshold of consciousness, there's so many irrational thoughts and maybe buried memories or conflicting desires, all kinds of parts to ourselves that we'd rather not confront at an individual level. And this, I think, might explain the tendency in sci-fi cinema to convey extraterrestrial life forms as hostile, invading and threatening the human species. It's kind of just like a manifestation in outer space of an internal perception. And because that's never going to go away, that's just a part of human condition. I think we will always rely on filmmaking and other types of storytelling to deal with these things, like alienation, how we feel disconnected from other people and maybe from ourselves. I think maybe with the internet, there's a lot of potential for maybe a new genre of alien stories to be told. Who knows?
I love it. Yeah, it's great because I feel like we are, when I'm looking back at recent years, we've, the kind of trends in horror, I suppose, have kind of gone back the other way into more human domestic set environments and horrors, I suppose, whether it's, if you look at the biggest horror films of recent years and movies like Hereditary, even last year Malignant, these sorts of movies that are more psychological and more human, I suppose. But it's going to be interesting to see, post everything that's happened in this last year, where those trends are going to go now and whether we're going to go back to Because also I think there is also an element of fun and escapism too about space and sci-fi horror, isn't there, as well? And maybe we're going to want to embrace that a little bit more as well, you know?
Yeah, definitely. There's the fun side, you know? There's the kind of irreverent, absurdist side of the idea of encountering an alien.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I like that the subgenre gives us an opportunity to hold space for all of these different things. As you say, it's very diverse.
And there's something, I don't know if you find this, almost comforting, I think, in the idea that we are but a dot in this universe, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's there's two ways of looking at, you know, the reality that we're literally a speck of dust in the cosmos. And we don't even know how many universes there are. There could be multiverses, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, you could look at it as, oh my God, you know, we are alone. We only know of life form on this planet and no one can hear us screaming in space.
Yeah.
And that's like existentially like dreadful.
Yeah.
But the other side of that is, oh my God, nothing matters. Like,
right.
I'm just gonna live it up. I'm gonna have a great time.
Exactly. Well, Mary, as ever, thank you so much. I've absolutely loved going on this journey through the cosmos with you over the last few months, and I hope that we'll be back doing more horror exploration in the next series together.
Well, I would love that. And as ever, I've always, you know, I love interacting with your listeners.
Yes.
And I want to say thank you to them for the lovely feedback they've given me. And it's wonderful. This is a wonderful project for me to be involved in, and I look forward to exploring more films.
Yes, cannot wait. Mary, in the meantime, just let us know, what else have you got going on at the moment with your podcast and Patreon and everything else that people can check out?
Sure. So, well, I guess I would advise everyone, if you're interested in psychoanalysis and cinema, definitely subscribe to the podcast that I co-host with Sarah Cleaver, Projections Podcast. But you can also sign up to my Patreon. That's patreon.com/Mary Wild. And you can follow me at PsychStar on Twitter and Instagram.
Amazing. Well, Mary, until next series, thank you so much.
Thanks, Mike. Bye.
Bob with Sydney.
I've seen this movie before.
Not this movie.
That was a little clip you just heard there from Scream 5, also known as Scream, which is out in cinemas. If you're listening to this podcast episode on the day it dropped, it's out today. Scream is out in cinemas right now. How exciting. This is a big deal for me. I'm a huge Scream fan, so a new Scream movie is, I guess it's the way a lot of you guys might feel about a new Halloween movie. I'm super excited that we have a new Scream film. I have already seen it. I won't say a word because I know that people really don't want to know anything when it comes to this movie, so I won't say anything. But if you want to know what I did think of the new Scream, then get yourself subscribed to the Hello Sydney podcast. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts. That is an exclusive limited series made in partnership with Paramount Pictures, hosted by me, Anna Bogutskaya and Louise Blaine, and we've been working our way through all of the Scream movies in order. So we covered Scream from 96, Scream 2 from 97, Scream 3 from 2000 and Scream 4 from 2011. So you can hear all of those episodes right now, and then imminently we will be dropping our Scream 5 episode, in which we discuss the new Scream movie, both spoiler-free and in spoilerific detail. Not only that, I think I'm going to be dropping some bonus Scream-related content on my own Patreon to dive even deeper into the new Scream movie and go super nerdy on this one. So a lot of Scream content coming your way. So get yourself subscribed to Hello Sydney and sign up to our Patreon for more Scream content. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. Everybody who signs up to our Patreon will get a little shout out on the main podcast as a thank you. And speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who signed up in the last couple of weeks a very special thanks. So a big thank you to Jake Nabilski, Linda Del Geni, Christian Bird, Georgina Conformity, Jordan Malone, Rachel White, Tony Reiner, Cece, David Goodman, Lauren Brown, Peter Anthony, John Aldera, Jaxiel Carmona, Mark Slater, Matt Fisher, Erin Black, Damon Laffin, Rob McIntyre, Aaron Varnum, Michael Basham, Sean Drummond, Tara Watkins, Sean Lyons, Marcus Fry, and Flex Toomey. Thank you so much to all of those people for signing up to our Patreon. And one more time, if you want to join them and get treated to regular bonus or weekly episodes throughout our hiatus, then sign up now. Patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. That's patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. Okay, we are going to finish this episode and this series by reading some audience feedback before then revealing your top 10 alien sci-fi cosmic horror movies. So let's dive straight into the mailbag and read some of this lovely feedback. Huge thank you to all of you guys for sending me such lovely feedback and comments. This email came from Trina Findley. She starts off by looking back at her 2021 in horror before talking about the Alien series. So Trina says, "Hi Mike, interestingly, I've experienced my best films of 2021 in the latter part of the year. Thanks to the Evolution of Horror Facebook group, I met the lovely Deborah Mansky, who also lives in Tasmania. I now have a fellow horror-loving movie nerd to share my passion with. Together, we've been fortunate enough to see Lamb, Last Night in Soho, and Titan at our local independent cinema, all within the last couple of months. Up until last weekend, In the Earth was my standout favourite horror film of 2021. I had high expectations and Ben Wheatley didn't disappoint. I was grateful that my sound system was up to Clint Mansell's fantastically evocative music. Reece Shearsmith is brilliant as always, Dan Martin's effects are gloriously gruesome, and while I wasn't exactly sure what was going on for a big chunk of the film, I was more than happy to sit back and go along for the ride. As 2021 draws to a close, I'm preparing myself for that inevitable sinking feeling that I get knowing we're coming to the end of another great season. As always, a massive thank you to you and your amazing co-hosts for an incredible lineup. I've never thought of myself as a massive fan of the Alien subgenre, but surprisingly, I found that I have seen most of the films covered. This season had probably seen me add fewer new discoveries to my movie library than past seasons, which was a bit of a revelation. I thoroughly enjoyed the opportunity to revisit old favourites such as Quatermass and the Pit, The Faculty and Rocky Horror, and the many highlights for me include marvelling at Kevin Lyons' bewilderingly encyclopedic knowledge in the intro episode, feeling relieved I wasn't alone in my confusion/enjoyment of Phantasm, and sharing Becky's delights in the joy that is Event Horizon." Thank you so much for that lovely, lovely email, Trina, and as ever, thank you so much for all of your support this last year. I do agree, actually, that's something that a lot of people have touched upon, that this series had the least kind of new discoveries for them, for better or worse. And for some people, that's a plus. For other people, that's a minus. But I think generally, there are a lot of big hitters in the Alien series. There are a lot of movies that most people were already very familiar with. Less weird, unusual movies that people had never heard of. However, there were a few, right? I would say Extro, for a lot of people, Resolution and The Endless. For me, The Hidden. These were some new discoveries, but of course there are a lot of major big hitters in this series. This email comes from Summer Mormenio. She says, "I've been an avid listener for the past couple of years now. I conveniently found your podcast a couple of months before the pandemic, entertaining me and educating me through some rough and lonely times. I consider myself a huge horror fan. It's how most people know me, but still, each season it seems like I have much more to explore. So each season I think, this is it. This is the season I'm going to watch every movie from every episode, and well, that never happens. When the sci-fi Alien season was announced, I was so excited because of my infatuation with aliens and everything that comes with it. Still, I was also worried because as much as I love the topic, I thought my movie catalogue was probably the weakest here. And oh my god, I was so wrong. Each week, I found myself getting excited all over again about the forthcoming week's episode. Everything from retro 50s to Rocky Horror, and then the finale covering 10 Cloverfield Lane. Thank you so much for all you do and making me realise that alien and cosmic horror holds such a special place in my heart, just as I suspected." Thank you so much for that lovely email, Summer. This one comes from Murray Lothian. Murray says, "Hello Mike, when you first announced released the Alien season, I had my doubts, given how expansive the subgenre is. But you and your guests did a fantastic job in cherry-picking the key films in the genre. Alien is my favourite horror film of all time, along with Aliens not far behind. So thank you for diving so deep into that series. I did feel the need to scream at my phone when you and your guests were too hot on Alien 3. Possibly it's nostalgia from seeing it at an all too young and impressionable age, but its nihilistic tone, Weaver's all-or-nothing performance, and Fincher's keen eye means that it's a massively undervalued film, especially the assembly cut. Also, time will be kind to Scott's Prometheus and Alien Covenant. In the days of uber-safe reboots and soft remakes, Scott's gonzo visions improve with every rewatch. Thank you also for devoting an episode to Benson and Moorhead, two of the most interesting and unique directors around, and two of the most charming guys you could ever meet. Brad and yourself beating up The Fourth Kind was interesting, as the film itself is utter guff, but it caused me sleepless nights, which is weird, given I'm a pretty hardcore horror head. Anyway, Happy New Year, Murray. Thank you so much, Murray, for that lovely email. And yeah, I know, The Fourth Kind, me and Brad were very down on, the both of us. And actually, I have had quite a lot of messages from people saying, how dare you be so mean about that film? It gave me sleepless nights. So there you go. It did work on a lot of people, which is great. I wish it worked on me in that way. And yes, when it comes to Alien 3, I know I was pretty harsh on Alien 3, and I still stand by that. I don't think it's a great film in a lot of ways. I did find a bit of a new appreciation for it watching it this time round for the podcast. And I think that, and I stand by what I think, which is that I think it's an excellent Ripley film and a perfect conclusion to the trilogy of Ripley story, but it's a bad Alien film. It's a bad horror film too. And I think that there are better ones in the series. And I'm intrigued to know if you're going to be right about Prometheus and Covenant, like that whether over time people are going to come to appreciate them more. You might be absolutely right there. Only time will tell. This email comes from Vincent Gain. Vincent says, Mike, you interstellar treasure. Another magnificent season with fabulous guests and amazing discussions. Sci-fi has been my wheelhouse for decades, and I had seen more of the films this season than any previous. Plus, I love your willingness to stretch the boundaries of horror. Independence Day and Mars Attacks might be the stretchiest stretches so far, but hey, your podcast, your rules. Thank you for recommending so much. I delighted in discovering this season's strange new worlds, new life, and new civilizations. On that note, you mentioned during your District 9 chat with the fabulous Rihanna that you have never gotten into Star Trek. As a Trekker, I feel it is my Starfleet duty to recommend for you some horror-inflected Star Trek episodes. These are all pretty much standalone episodes, so you can check them out individually. I love this. And then Vincent goes on, I won't read the rest of it, but he goes on in the rest of his email to actually list and recommend all of the key Star Trek horror episodes. This is amazing, Vincent. Thank you so much for this. And I really am keen to dip my toe into the Star Trek universe at some point. So I will actually follow this list and check some of them out. Thank you so much for your kind words and lovely feedback, Vincent. And speaking of lists of episodes, I'm going to read this next comment here from Jane Murphy. Jane says, Hi Mike, this season has been my favourite so far, just because of the sheer amount of absolute classics that we got to revisit. But I have to say the highlight for me, and possibly my favourite episode ever, was the X-Files. I can't imagine how difficult it must have been for you and Anna to boil a huge series like that down to a single discussion, but you both did a great job capturing what was so fabulous about that series and why it still remains such an important horror sci-fi property. Listening to your 20 favourite episodes inspired me to revisit the series for the first time in over a decade, and many of those episodes, particularly Squeeze and Tombs, still terrify me to this day. Thank you again for all you do, and can't wait for the next series. Thank you so much, Jane, for that lovely email. And yes, I'm actually so grateful. I'm so pleased to hear that feedback on the X-Files episode, because I was kind of nervous about that episode. Same with Doctor Who. These are huge properties that it's almost impossible to do justice to in a single conversation. And I was so grateful for the lovely comments that we got on both those those episodes, Doctor Who and the X-Files. And of course, you always get a few weirdos that dip in, especially Doctor Who. There were a few Doctor Who weirdos that sort of dipped into that single episode and sent me some quite nasty messages and tweets and sort of aimed some quite unnecessary nasty stuff at me and my guest for that episode. But whatever, they weren't the regular EOHers, they were just weird Doctor Who nutters. And the same went for the X-Files, but on the whole, the positive feedback for those 2 episodes was overwhelming, so I'm so pleased about that because, I think the X-Files in particular is probably the most amount of hours prep I've ever done for a single episode of Evolution of Horror. It was so many hours of television and reading and watching documentaries, and I hope it kind of paid off because that conversation I had with the amazing Anna, who of course is always brilliant, is one of my personal favourite episodes I've ever done of the podcast. So thank you. It really means a lot hearing that feedback from you, Jane. So thank you so much for that email. This email comes from Hunter Robinson. Hunter says, "Hi Mike, another terrific season. The highlights for me were From Beyond and Event Horizon episode with Becky Dark. And what could be my favourite episode not only of this season but of all time, the X-Files episode. The X-Files is my favourite TV show and the episode made me so excited to revisit the series. Also loved classics like Alien and The Thing that were covered, and the also-rans with Brad Hanson are always so much fun. Looking forward to the next season, and thanks to you and your wonderful guests for creating the best horror podcast." Thank you so much for that lovely email, Hunter. This email comes from Josh Evans. Josh says, "Hi Mike, I have mixed feelings on this season. While all of the discussions were great to listen to, the inner horror nerd in me was a bit disappointed that I'd already seen all of the movies covered, and there were very few unknown gems from outside of the US or the UK. I'm hoping that the next season might dig a little deeper. So far, my rankings of favourite to least favourite seasons of your podcast are as follows. Folk horror at number 1, followed by Mind and Body, Occult, Ghosts, then Aliens, Slashers, and Zombies at the bottom. Thank you for everything you do. Can't wait for the next series." Thank you, Josh, for that email. And I love that you're actually ranking seasons of the podcast. And I totally get it. It's fair enough. Yep, we did cover a lot of big... This season was the season of big blockbuster hits, wasn't it? And there were less niche properties to delve into. But I'm sure there will be, hopefully, a few more of those to explore in the next series. This email comes from Joseph Russ. Joseph says, "Hi Mike, just wondering if you've ever seen Encounter. It's an absolutely stunning film in the vein of Midnight Special about a father who kidnaps his sons to protect them from an alien parasite that is taking over the minds of people. Amazing performance from Riz Ahmed and 2 boys playing his sons, and brilliant direction from Michael Pearce, who directed Beast. It's one of the best films I saw in 2021, but I suspect it hasn't found the audience it deserves." Thank you, Joe. I have seen Encounter, and I wish I loved it as much as you did, but I didn't, I'm afraid. I thought Riz Ahmed was excellent, and I loved the setup. It really reminded me of Midnight Special as well, actually, which I loved. And actually, that was a kind of omission, wasn't it? We didn't mention Midnight Special at all this series. Should have mentioned that. But anyway, yeah, Encounter, the setup really got me. I loved it. I loved that it reminded me of Midnight Special. I loved the world that it created. And then, I won't spoil anything, but the direction that it ends up going in and the story that it actually ends up telling was a lot less interesting to me personally. And I was a bit disappointed in where that film ended up in its second half. So I didn't love it. And I really love Michael Pearce as a director. I thought Beast was one of the best movies of the year it came out. But yeah, unfortunately, didn't love Encounter, but I'm glad you loved it. This email comes from Thomas DeFlora. This is another recommendation. Hi, Mike. I just wanted to mention a left out alien gem. 1982's Liquid Sky, crazy and brilliant. 96% on Rotten Tomatoes, and the line, "I kill with my cunt." Need I say any more? Thank you, Tom. Amazing, Tom. Well, I mean, with a line of dialogue like that, I'm going to have to check it out, aren't I? So that's 1982's Liquid Sky. Cannot wait. And we got a few other comments and emails and tweets from people with movies that didn't get a mention this series, particularly in our Also Rans episode. There were so many to mention, but we did obviously miss a few. I got this comment from PD Zombie on YouTube just saying, what about The World's End? Of course, I forgot about The World's End. Completely passed me by. Same with Brad. It's not a great film, is it? I mean, it's not a very memorable film. It's definitely the worst of the Cornetto trilogy, but it does have some fun moments, and I completely forgot, to be honest, that is an Alien film. Yeah, should have given that a mention. Apologies, we did not give that a mention in our Also Rans, but thank you for that reminder. This email comes from Chris Newton. Chris says, hello Mike, just wanted to say how much I've enjoyed the last season. Predictably, the Phantasm episode was my favourite, and I was so touched that you read out my message. The Alien series has really pushed the boundaries in terms of what can be discussed on a horror podcast. While films like Independence Day or the Rocky Horror Picture Show could never normally be considered horror in the truest sense, it's been really interesting to examine them through the context of cultural fears and anxieties surrounding the other and invasions. It just goes to show what a great vehicle that idea of the evolution of the horror genre is. In a sense, sci-fi is probably the best barometer of any given culture's zeitgeist. It's particularly interesting that a film like Independence Day, with its not so subtle theme of American patriotism, came from the same era as Scream, a horror which swaps fear of the boogeyman in the haunted house for fear of the youth of today, and that idea of the enemy within. The diversity of films covered in this series has made me realise that some of my favourite movies, which I never thought could be discussed on the pod, such as The Terminator and Tremors, will make up really important and interesting parts of discussion on the monster genre. Cannot wait. Thank you so much for making my daily commute a joy, Chris. Thank you, Chris. That's really lovely. And yeah, you're so right about that. That's some really interesting points you made there. And actually, you know, Terminator, I will say Terminator isn't in the top 10 sci-fi horror movies in this episode, and we haven't covered it this series, obviously, because it's not an Alien film, but Terminator did pop up in a lot of people's lists, I guess because they were thinking generally of sci-fi horror. And it is, I do agree that it is absolutely a horror film, and I will be covering The Terminator in the future. In some ways, it's a sort of slasher movie, isn't it? But I think I'm going to cover The Terminator on a monsters season, a man-made monsters season, basically. So when it comes to covering man-made monsters, you know, Frankenstein and that kind of thing, I think The Terminator would fit perfectly in that. This email comes from Jamie Allenson. Jamie says, hi Mike, Happy New Year and many thanks for bringing us another highly enjoyable and informative series. I'm especially fond of both cosmic horror and the hazy ground between sci-fi and horror, so I really enjoyed this season. One question I had was whether or not you were going to touch on the Day of the Triffids in its several adaptations, and in the end, of course, it didn't feature in the series at all. Although the story is not technically an alien invasion, the eponymous botanical horrors being the result of Cold War bioengineering in the horror novel, I would argue that the narrative is structurally the same. Indeed, the 1960s film adaptation just makes the Triffids aliens without skipping a beat, and very much fits in the British interpretation of the alien invasion movie of that era, which you touched upon in the podcast. In fact, the different adaptations give a good lens through which to look at the changing sensibilities of British horror, from the Eastman Colour 1960s version to the excellent 1981 TV series, which has a real sense of Neilian chill, as in Nigel Neal, to the pompous and gloopy 2009 version. Anyway, just a note, wondering what you think and where you think this would fit in the genre. Keep up the good work. Oh, Jamie, thank you for that email, and that's such a good point. Again, a complete omission on my part. Day of the Triffids is a hugely important text, and you're right, it would have actually fit kind of perfectly in that British 1960s sort of Quatermass Nigel Neal television kind of vibe and era, wouldn't it? It probably should have been covered there. But again, you know, this idea of it not really being an alien, but actually the sort of a bioengineering Cold War thing, like The Terminator, it could fit quite well in the idea of man-made monsters. So maybe we'll fit that into a later season, because I would be Really keen to cover the Day of the Triffids in the future. So thank you so much for that email, Jamie. This email comes from Aaron Curran. Aaron says, "Hi Mike, thanks so much for all of your hard work putting together the latest season. I began listening to your podcast in 2019 when I stumbled across the folk horror season, and it quickly became one of my must-hears. I co-host a weekly film and TV soundtrack music show myself called Celluloid Symphonies, so I know how much effort each show takes. My question for you is, what's been the most enjoyable series or film that the Alien season has prompted you to watch? I'm going to guess The X-Files, as it sounded like you were only an occasional viewer before digging into the full series. Did I guess right? In terms of constructive feedback, I think this season has covered such a broad topic that the cosmic horror elements have been overshadowed by the alien ones. I'm not entirely sure that Resolution and The Endless, for example, have much in common thematically with War of the Worlds or Alien. I've been deep diving into Lovecraftian horror in recent years, and I'd have loved if you'd kept digging and chatting about that topic, e.g. films like The Void, Banshee Chapter, or the excellent short film AM 1200 that David Pryor directed before making The Empty Man. If you haven't seen the latter particularly, I encourage you to squeeze its 40-minute running time into your life. Thanks, Mike. I'm grateful for all of your listeners, and all the best to you and Rihanna." Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for that lovely email, Aaron. And let me just answer the first part of that first of all. So you asked what's been the most enjoyable part of this series, the most enjoyable discovery. I would say there are 3 things that I've loved discovering and discussing this series. One of them is absolutely The X-Files, as you mentioned. That was one of my most fun discussions and one of my sort of proudest episodes to put together. Another one is Phantasm. I really, really loved Phantasm. I've now got such warm feelings towards that whole series and that box set. It's kind of elevated itself into one of my favourite horror franchises. It really has. I loved revisiting it. I love talking about it. It's such a weird and wonderful thing that I kind of found it endlessly fascinating to think about and discuss, and I really loved that conversation with Steph McKenna about those films. And the last one that sticks out for me as a highlight is Extro. I had never seen Extro before Stevie Webb put it on my radar, and we covered it for this series. And oh my god, I guess I just really love these really out there, weird and wonderful movies that make no logical sense but have such a vibe and are made with so much love, I suppose. I think that's the thing when it comes to both Phantasm and Extro. They're not perfect, either of them, but you can just feel that they're made with such love, and that really made me happy. So I think they would be my highlights. And in terms of your feedback about cosmic horror, you're right. I mean, cosmic horror wasn't covered as much as alien invasion movies this series. And I always struggle with this when I program a season in, what I put where. I personally don't think that cosmic sort of Lovecraftian horror is a big enough area to give its own season on the podcast. So I felt like this was a good way to cover it, to kind of lump it in, I suppose, with alien horror. And the other reason I do that as well is just to mix it up a bit, is to make sure that the seasons don't feel like we're covering the same type of movie over and over again. People often poke fun at me for what I classify horror and what I classify under certain subgenres. But the reason I do it is because it invites more conversation, and because it makes you think about things in a different way, and because it mixes up the sorts of films that you get to talk about. If I stuck very rigidly to just movies about aliens invading and attacking the Earth, then it might have got a little bit samey. If I had just stuck just to movies set in space, it might have also got a bit samey. I wanted to do a broad enough season so that it kind of chopped and changed from week to week. It's the same reason why I did the Mind and Body series, because I felt like body horror as a thing was a little bit too niche to do a whole season on, and not enough people, a lot of people really don't like body horror, I'm also thinking about it from from a producer perspective in terms of what will get me the most downloads. And I think having a season that has a mix of different films that will appeal to different types of horror fans is also really important. I wouldn't want to spend 30 weeks on a particular type of horror film that a lot of people just don't like, because then I would lose a whole bunch of listeners for 30 weeks, you know? And I think cosmic horror kind of falls into that wheelhouse. I love Resolution, I love The Endless, and movies like The Void and Banshee Chapter are great, but these are all super niche films when you think about it. There aren't any big hitters in the cosmic horror world. So I kind of feel like I had to lump them in with the big hitters like Alien and The Thing and Signs and The Mist and whatever else, just to kind of give the season a bit of texture, I suppose. So I hope that makes sense. And I know that that means things get missed out and things don't get covered maybe as much as they could be. But, you know, who knows what's going to happen in the future, Aaron? Who knows what movies we might end up covering in different seasons, in different themes later on in the podcast. So thank you so much for that lovely email, Aaron. This email comes from Harry Steele. Harry says, "Dear Mike, this season may have been the best one yet, and it was a genius decision to focus on alien and cosmic horror after the wide-ranging Mind and Body series. However, I have been surprised about how much The Thing has featured as people's favourite alien horror movie. There's no denying it's a masterpiece, but when I went to a cinema screening of it, I found it really strange how McCready and Co.'s big plan to defeat The Thing is to blow it up with explosives, despite them knowing that even the tiniest fragment of it can be dangerous. It always takes me out of the movie a bit, but I'm clearly and happily in the minority. It's impossible for me to come up with a ranking, but my favourite alien movie must be Under the Skin, as it happens to be one of my favourite movies of all time. It's one of the few films I can think of that offers a truly inhuman perspective of humanity, and it's chilling to experience. Although it featured in your Mind and Body season, it could easily fit in both the alien and cosmic subgenres of horror. Best wishes, can't wait for the next season." Thank you so much, Harry, and you're absolutely right. Under the Skin, although we covered it in our Mind and Body season, it fits perfectly in alien and cosmic horror. I mean, in some ways, there is none more cosmic than Under the Skin, right? And, well, you'll see very shortly, but Under the Skin popped up in a lot of people's top 10s. This comment came from Jamie Holmes on Patreon. He said, "Did Close Encounters of the Third Kind ever get a mention? Although not horror, it does contain a terrifying scene when the child gets abducted from the house, and it is also one of the greatest sci-fi movies about alien visitations ever made." Yeah, you're right, Jamie. It didn't get a mention. Close Encounters, along with 2001: A Space Odyssey, both have moments of real horror, even though they're not really horror movies. But yeah, I mean, in some ways, they've got a lot more horror in them than Mars Attacks, right? So maybe I should have included Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Maybe we'll find a way to cover it on a Patreon special or something in the future. This is interesting. This is a comment from Matt Socia, also on Patreon. He says, "Great season with some great first watches for me, especially Annihilation, The Hidden, and Rocky Horror. I wanted to get your thoughts on the cosmic and Lovecraftian part of the subgenre. This is perhaps a controversial opinion, but I think the world is still waiting for the great cosmic horror film. By that I mean one that resonates with the public and becomes a cultural touchstone in the way Alien has for Aliens, The Exorcist has for occult, the big three have for slashers, etc. There are lots of cosmic horrors that I'm sure many listeners love, but they all strike me as niche, mostly celebrated and watched by genre lovers only. What do you and your listeners think? Am I wrong? My hope is that if ever Guillermo del Toro's rumoured adaptation of At the Mountains of Madness gets made, then that gap will be filled. But until then, I'll ponder the void, waiting." I think that's such a good point, Matt, and I think that goes back actually to my response to Aaron's comment from earlier when he said that cosmic horror was a little bit underserved this series. And I think cosmic horror hasn't quite become a subgenre yet, has it? I think, in terms of kind of a series of culturally important and recognisable movies that all fit a particular set of tropes. I don't think it actually has reached that status yet, and I think you're absolutely right. As much as, many of us sort of hardcore genre fans love From Beyond and Annihilation and even Event Horizon, these movies haven't quite passed into the mainstream yet. And you're right, you've got some perfect examples there. In every other subgenre, you've got at least one major breakthrough film, whether it's Halloween in slashers, The Shining in ghosts, The Wicker Man in folk. And there isn't really that yet for cosmic horror. And again, that loops back to what I was saying earlier, that I don't think I would be able to give cosmic horror its own series necessarily, because it just doesn't have that accessibility yet for non-genre fans. So thank you so much for that excellent comment, Matt. This comment comes from Aaron Travis. He says, I went into this season thinking it was going to be something I didn't care about. Then you brought back so many of my formative favourites. The real sweet spot for me, though, was the Also Rans episode. This was chock-a-block with good memory after good memory. Alien horror for me is about crazy over-the-top concept schlock than anything else. And that episode hit most of my faves. Paul says, as ever, I enjoy the Also Rans episodes because as an old buffer, I've usually seen the majority of the season's main features, but Brad's Also Ran episodes normally give me one or two gems to seek out. Special mention this season goes to the Annihilation episode for making me rethink my opinion of it. Was rather underwhelmed on first viewing, but after listening to your episode, I've given it another chance and I've gotten much more out of it. Finally, the Benson and Moorhead episode really cements my feeling that they are two of the most interesting horror sci-fi filmmakers of the last decade. Every single one of their films has made me think on some level, and that really is something to be celebrated. Thank you so much, Paul, for that lovely message. And yeah, I haven't got time to read them all, but we've had a lot of comments about people thanking the podcast for introducing them to Benson and Moorhead, and more people discovering Benson and Moorhead as, as Paul said there, two of the best horror and genre filmmakers that have been working quietly over this last decade. This email comes from Jason Pullin. Jason says, I have to tell you that the Alien series has been my favourite so far. Mind and Body a close second. Before I got into horror, my genre of choice was sci-fi, and I do think they have a lot in common. I think along with a few people, I have to thank you for introducing a couple of films that were new to me. Extro and From Beyond. They were both so much fun and so weird. I also loved the 80s The Blob. I don't know why the film isn't held in much higher regard. Thank you, Jason. Yeah, actually, that's another one I forgot to mention, but another discovery for me from this series was Chuck Russell's The Blob. What an astounding film, and I cannot believe I'd never seen that before. So yeah, really, really happy to discover that film for the first time this series as well. This email comes from Mary Somerville. Mary says, hello, Mike. Just wanted to say how much I enjoy the podcast. It's been fascinating learning about horror after being put off the genre by the torture porn that was popular when I was growing up. It's clear how much hard work and passion both you and your guests put into each episode. Your Alien series has been another great one, but something I found interesting is that other than Bad Taste and District 9, I think every other film on the main episode has been either British or American. Were there any films from other countries you thought about featuring, or is alien horror pretty much an Anglophone thing? Thanks again for the pod. Hope you get a decent break before the next series. Thank you, Mary. And yeah, I've touched upon this already, and I know a few of you have given me similar feedback here that a lot of the films from this series were your big mainstream English language Hollywood or British movies, and you're absolutely right. And I guess it's just such a vast genre, and there are so many huge ones to cover from America and the UK that I may have just completely omitted to look for certain foreign language movies, and that is that's just bias on my part, I suppose, and I do apologize for that. And if anyone's got any interesting non-English language alien movies that you'd love to recommend, I'd love to try and see more and discuss them, and maybe we can find room on Patreon to do them as little bonus extras, because that's entirely my fault, really. I didn't even think about it when compiling the list, but you're right, nearly all of these movies come from either the US or the UK. So thank you so much for that lovely feedback, Mary. And I'll finish on this email from Peter Jetnikoff. Peter says, Alien horror got to me early on after Doctor Who and old 50s movie reruns on TV suggested that the military town I grew up in would be a prime target. There was also a sense of despair that an alien invasion felt so hopeless for us. More than ghosts or monstrous threats that could fire a child's imagination, a threat from another world felt almost likely. Put this down to a lot of exploitative media in the 70s, which gleefully suggested as much. This wore off with adulthood, but to this day, I can't resist a sci-fi tinged horror or the more cosmic scaled Benson and Moorhead universe. I've loved this series. Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you so much for all of those amazing, wonderful comments and emails. You guys are all so awesome, and as ever, I feel like I say this at the end of every series, but thank you for being just the coolest bunch of podcast listeners, and I love this community that this podcast has created, so thank you all so much. Okay, well now it's time to get into your top 10 alien, sci-fi and cosmic horror movies. I put out a little post on Instagram, on Patreon, on Twitter, on the Facebook discussion group for all of your top 10s. And so all of you guys delivered. I got emails in their dozens, comments in their hundreds, and it took me a while, but I've compiled all of your top 10s, okay? As ever, I've kind of scored them accordingly. So your number 1 pick gets 10 points, your number 2 pick gets 9 points, etc., all the way down to your number 10 pick getting 1 point. So that's how I've scaled it. Now, what I'll do is I'll read through each movie on the list, and then I'm going to read some comments from you guys all throughout the series on the Evolution of Horror discussion group on Facebook. I ask for everyone's thoughts every week on the movie being covered, and all of you guys send me such great thoughts. So I've compiled some of those to read out as we go through each entry on this list. Now, actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with number 11 with a movie that narrowly, by literally a few points, missed out on making it into the top 10. And it's such a good and important film, I thought it would be really nice to include it. So at number 11, just missing out on making it into your top 10, was Benson and Moorhead's The Endless.
Everything you did might come back now. There's something out here, isn't there?
This makes me really happy because for me, The Endless and all of Benson and Moorhead's movies are so niche and still a relatively not very well known, particularly compared to some of the big hitters in this top 10. So I was actually so pleased to see so much love for it from you guys, and it really just narrowly missed out on getting into the top 10. So I just wanted to give it a moment to appreciate that. We've got a few lovely comments from listeners here from the Facebook group. Jules Boyle said, I'd completely missed out on these guys for some reason until I heard you talking about them on the pod, and I was absolutely blown away. Kim Majors said, I kept seeing previews for The Endless on Netflix and I put off watching it for the longest time. Finally watched and loved it. Thanks to EOH, I sought out and watched all the other Benson and Moorhead movies. Now a huge fan and cannot wait to see what they come up with next. John Draper said, these guys are for horror what Chris Nolan is for mainstream blockbusters. Filmmakers that don't patronise their audience, require them to keep up and create worlds that audiences are intrigued by and want to explore and investigate. And The Endless is their masterpiece. Tobias Mundy says, I'm very grateful for having these films introduced to me. The thing that really impresses me is that beyond the big ideas and the filming is just the writing. The characterization is so impressive. Writing real characters is an impressive feat. Just stunning. So there you go. That was Benson and Moorhead's The Endless from 2016, and that narrowly missed out on making it into your top 10. Okay, let's go to number 10 then on your list. At number 10, a classic for a lot of you. For me, a new discovery. It's Chuck Russell's The Blob. So this is the Blob remake, of course, from 1988. This message came from Jane in Scotland. Jane said, Hi Mike, like you, I had never seen the Blob 1988 before this series, and I sought it out after you and your guest sang its praises. I couldn't believe this one passed me by. What a spectacular film. A great story, fantastic cast, visually stunning, and special effects that rival The Fly or The Thing. A new absolute favourite for me. This comment was from Duncan Maitland. He said, I saw The Blob at the cinema in 88 when it was released. An absolute thrill ride in front of an audience. And the great thing is that nothing has changed over the years. Jules Boyle says, I love the original, but this one easily tops it. Up there with The Thing and The Fly as the only remakes that improve upon the original. So there you go. That was your number 10. That was the incredible and very gross The Blob from 1988. On to number 9 then, and this is a really interesting movie. Again, one that sparked so many interesting discussions this series, one that Mary Wilde has already talked about in this episode. Your number 9 is Predator.
Come on in, you fuckers. Come on in. Old Painless is waiting.
Love that you guys have put Predator so high on your list. Ollie Menham said, Predator is a blinding classic, full of quotable one-liners and a final showdown that must rank amongst the greatest ever put to film. Rebecca Cullen says, Predator remains a truly unique film. It's a macho war movie, but it's also a slasher film with its very own kind of special final girl. Sadly, none of the sequels have come close, but the original is so perfect, so quotable, and infinitely rewatchable. Loved the conversation about it and never thought about the way it also juggles tropes of folk horror and even Italian cannibal movies too. Thanks for a great series. Thank you guys for those comments, and yeah, I love Predator. As I said in the podcast, it's basically a flawless movie, right? It's pretty much perfect. It was a shame about the sequels, but we'll always have that original. So that's your number 9. That's the amazing Predator. Okay, on to your number 8. I think for me, this is the most surprising one in the top 10. I was not expecting this to be as highly regarded as it was. I'm a massive fan of it, but I didn't think you guys were. But you voted at number 8, Alex Garland's Annihilation. Oh my god, it deserves to be in the list just for that terrifying bear monster, I think. But I love that you guys have voted this in so many of your lists. It's an absolute favourite of mine. Vincent Gaines says, a shimmering, stylish sci-fi horror of grief, regret, pursuits and alterations. Matt Troy says, I didn't love this when I first saw it, but the podcast discussion prompted me to give it a second go. I don't know if it was the mood I was in or different expectations, but it was like an entirely different viewing experience. What I previously found ponderous and slow, I now found thought-provoking, tense and profoundly moving. The final sequence with Natalie Portman and the alien facing off against each other is an absolute all-timer, and now I'm already looking forward to watching the film again. I love that. What an incredible film. It is hypnotic, it's mesmerizing, and it's a movie that you could probably explore and dissect forever. That's the incredible Alex Garland's Annihilation, and that's your number 8. Moving up to number 7 then, and it's a film that we discussed alongside Annihilation in the same episode. It's Frank Darabont's The Mist. Vincent Gaines says, one of the grimmest portrayals of humanity you will ever see, and a double kick in the teeth for the ages. Julie Barrett says, how is it that a film feels so heartfelt and comforting, yet so bleak and mean-spirited at the same time? The monsters are terrifying, but nothing will ever be as disturbing as Mrs. Carmody, a true modern masterpiece that often doesn't get the recognition it deserves. I totally agree, and I guess if we were to classify this under cosmic horror, I think this would be the closest thing we have to the great breakthrough cosmic horror movie. And even this isn't really a great, I don't think it quite reached mainstream audiences in the same way that it should have. But I think it's finally starting to get recognition as an absolute all-timer. I love this movie, and I'm so glad you do too. That's your number 7. That's the incredible The Mist. Now, at number 6, this is an interesting thing. At number 6, you guys voted in your droves for Jonathan Glazer's Under the Skin.
So you live alone?
Yes.
You think I'm pretty?
I know gorgeous.
I have a place about 30 minutes away.
Now, I don't have any comments to read on this one because we didn't cover it in this series. We actually covered it in our Mind and Body series, and weirdly, it was also placed as number 6 in your Mind and Body top 10s. So Under the Skin, I think now belongs in a very special place along with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre that has made it into 2 different top 10 movies of 2 different subgenres. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was in listeners' top 10 slasher movies as well as top 10 folk horror movies. And Under the Skin was number 6 in your Mind and Body top 10 as well as number 6 in your Alien and Cosmic top 10. I love that. Love Under the Skin. I mean, again, it's a perfect movie, isn't it? And if you want to hear your comments on that, you can listen to the final episode of the Mind and Body series. And of course, don't forget to tune into our Under the Skin episode in our Mind and Body series. Me and Brad Hanson had a fascinating discussion of that movie. And I also got to chat to one of the co-stars of that movie, Adam Pearson. So please do check that out. Okay, let's move into the listeners' top 5. I'm so pleased, again, at some of the weird and wonderful movies that you guys voted for as your favourites. At number 5, you guys have picked Event Horizon.
You can't leave. She won't let you.
What a film. What a film. Kai Schwind says, I watch Event Horizon once a year, both camp and terrifying. Chris Tinsley says, I remember going to see Event Horizon at the cinema, having no idea what it was about, and the cinema staff warning people it was a scary horror movie. If I remember right, the advertising campaign sold it as a space action movie, but I was totally blown away by it. Sandy S says, of all the films discussed this series, this is the one that feels the most like a classic gothic haunted house movie. The actual science stuff might be a bit nonsensical in this film, but it doesn't really matter. Event Horizon may have been marketed as a sci-fi actioner, but its big secret is that it's actually a small, supernatural, psychological horror movie like The Shining, an absolute all-time favourite for me. And this comment came from PD Zombie on YouTube. The horror of Event Horizon comes from the scientific possibility of hell being real, and anyone brought up in a religious environment can relate to that fear and guilt. The fear and guilt of thinking you're going to spend eternity there. Thank you so much for all those comments, and you're right, what's really special about Event Horizon is that it isn't really sci-fi in the same way that some of these other sci-fi movies are. It is almost a kind of occult or supernatural movie in a way. And it's just one, I mean, but however you classify it, isn't it just wonderful? Oh, we all had such high hopes for Paul W.S. Anderson, didn't we? Hey-ho. So that's your number 5. That's the incredible Event Horizon. Okay, let's move up to your number 4. Now, there was a considerable jump here when we get to the top 4. These 4 movies were your favourites by a country mile. We jump up by about 200 points here to get to number 4, which is the impeccable Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1978. Every time I think about this film, I just want to sit down and watch it again. I think it's slowly but surely becoming one of my absolute all-time favourites. I love this movie. Vincent Gaines says, a relentless and profoundly unsettling descent into gnawing paranoia, frantic fear, and the steady erosion of hope in the face of all-consuming conformity. Mike McHale says, a perfect movie. I often wonder why it doesn't get mentioned alongside Alien and The Thing as an all-time masterpiece of the genre. The special effects hold up so well, and there's a genuine, strange, queasy atmosphere running throughout. Not to mention one of the most horrifying, bleak endings of all time. Sarah Jessup says, one of my favourite things about Invasion of the Body Snatchers 78 is the horror that's happening on the periphery. Great films are ones that create whole worlds, ones that you believe are going on outside of the frame. And Body Snatchers feels like there are always other horrors going on just outside of what we can see. Whether it's tiny glimpses of garbage trucks collecting human remains, or strange human interactions actions happening in the background of shots. It's a film that's as detailed and precise as it is nightmarish and terrifying. And along similar lines, this comment came from Daniel Hartley on Facebook, who talked about some of his favourite creepy moments in the film. The priest, played by Robert Duvall at the beginning, who is almost certainly a pod person playing on the swings because it's just mimicking human behaviour, and everyone nearby is a child. Or the moment when you can faintly hear a pod person screaming really early in the film when someone runs past Donald Sutherland. I mean, you guys have summed up all of my thoughts on this film perfectly. You're so right, it's such a detailed film. It's one of those films that I'm sure you'd spot something new every time you watch it, and from that very opening scene, it creates such a sense of dread. There is a looming doom that is closing in on these characters from the periphery. It's there from the very beginning. And the sound design of this movie is just absolutely exquisite. What a masterpiece. That's your number 4. That's Invasion of the Body Snatchers, 1978. Okay, now I'm sure probably you guys can probably figure out what the top 3 movies are, but can you guess the order they'll be ranked in? Let's find out. At your number 3, you've gone with James Cameron's Aliens.
We better get back, because it'll be dark soon, and they mostly come at night. Mostly.
This has got to be one of the most easily rewatchable movies in the subgenre, right? I feel like I could sit and watch Aliens over and over and over again and never get tired of it. It's just so much fun. Paula Trench says, Aliens is simply the greatest sequel ever made. No other sequel has managed to bring something entirely new while also successfully building on the universe and mythology of the original. It's not easy to seamlessly blend haunted house horror with big bombastic war and action movies. But somehow, James Cameron pulls it off. Chris Burke said, can we stop having this argument about whether Aliens is or isn't a horror film? As discussed in the podcast, Aliens contains several of the most terrifying set pieces ever committed to film. Many horror films don't even come close to the sheer terror of the scene in which Ripley and Newt are trapped in the room with a facehugger, or the moment when the xenomorphs are crawling through the ceiling vents. Yes, completely agree with you, Chris. Vincent Gaines says, a relentless onslaught of suspense, thrills, spills, and intensity. Scary moments, but it works overall for me as an action film. Tom Trency says, a horror action epic that thrills and moves as much as it terrifies. Forget The Sound of Music or The Great Escape. This is the epic I watch every year on Boxing Day. I love that. What a perfect Boxing Day movie. Maybe I'll take up that tradition too, Tom. Thank you so much for those comments. That's your number 3. That's James Cameron's incredible Aliens. So, into the top 2. What's going to be number 1 and what's going to be number 2? Well, let's find out. Here's what you guys voted for as your number 2.
Dallas?
It's Alien. Do you know, I really thought this was probably going to be number 1, but it wasn't. Ridley Scott's 1979 original classic Alien, you guys voted for as your number 2. Robert Elms says, the perfect example of the synergy that occurs when that many disparate, talented people come together to serve a single vision. Ridley Scott's direction, Dan O'Bannon's story, H.R. Geiger's design, and Sigourney Weaver's performance are thrown into the boiling pot to make the most perfect horror film ever made. Ian Edward Olsen said, the best movie ever made, genre or not. I still have the old CBS Fox VHS and watch it regularly. Timothy Fox said, I was actually disappointed when seeing it in its theatrical debut. Only decades later, I can start to appreciate it as a well-made film. Paul Allen says, I first saw Alien on video in the early 80s in a double bill with The Shining. Oh my god, what an amazing double bill. They were the 2 movies I always wanted to see but didn't get the chance because I was too young for the cinema release. Finally, at 13 or 14 years of age, they blew my horror-loving mind. Once I'd watched them, I put them straight back in and watched them both again. David says, for me, the facehugger is the single most frightening thing living in cinema. Daniel Hartley says, the perfect film. Its structural perfection is matched only by its awesomeness. Ian Lasky says, masterpiece, love it, never tired of watching it. Joe Russ says, I think it's the sense of place that brings me back to this film. It's really a unique ship environment, and the individual sets, the rec room, the stasis room, and the computer room, feel like they've been designed as real working spaces. I've also relived the environment through the Alien Isolation game, which painstakingly recreates Nostromo in one of the add-ons. And Hunter Robinson says, top 10 of all-time material. What an incredible movie. So there you go. Can you believe it? Your number 2 alien, sci-fi and cosmic horror film of all time is Ridley Scott, Alien. So that leaves number 1. And actually, to be honest, this was number 1 by a country mile. It has over 200 points more than Alien in second place. And you may think you know what it is, but I think you might actually be really surprised. Can you believe that your number 1 that you guys voted is in fact... No, of course you know what it is. It's John Carpenter's The Thing. I had this conversation with Jamie Graham when we discussed the film, that it feels like it's sort of slowly becoming sort of the most beloved horror movie of all time. I think it actually now is starting to beat movies like The Exorcist and The Shining and The Texas Chainsaw in polls and lists. You know, I think it is actually becoming that big a deal. You know, The Thing is, and I saw it from your list, you know, a lot of people had Alien in their top 10, but not always necessarily at number 1. They often had it sort of near the top or midway. But for The Thing, so many of you actually had it as not just in your top 10, but as your number 1. And that's why it came leagues above everything else. Jules Boyle says, not just my favourite horror or favourite sci-fi, but the greatest film of all time in my book. Richard Sheltner says, I have had The Thing on VHS copied from the telly in 1988. It had all the gore intact, but the fucks removed. I watched the tape so many times, I can still remember the advert with Michael Elphick for bananas that was in the ad break after the husky scene. I love that. Vincent Gaines says, a taut, gripping and intense amalgam of claustrophobic tension, gruesome body horror and chilling nihilism. Kirsten Taylor says, I'm always torn whether I prefer Alien or The Thing, but if I'm honest, Alien has exceptional set pieces connected by certain stretches of not so interesting stuff that drags for me on rewatches. But with The Thing, there's not an ounce of fat. There's a weighty sense of dread from the opening frame which never lets up until that deeply bleak and ambiguous ending. And Leonard Ruskin says, most of the best horror films of all time can boast 1 or 2 great set pieces, but The Thing is all-time great set pieces followed by all-time great set pieces. The dog turning itself inside out, the blood test, the chest defibrillation, the ending, to name but a few. And all these moments are connected with some of the best character moments and performances in the genre's history. Even when nothing is happening, everything is happening. Forget Halloween. This is John Carpenter's true masterpiece. And there we go. Thank you so much for all of your comments, and thank you so much to all of you for sending in your top 10s. I'm going to run through your top 10 alien, sci-fi and cosmic horror movies one more time. At number 10, The Blob 88. At number 9, Predator. Number 8, Annihilation. Number 7, The Mist. Number 6, Under the Skin. Number 5, Event Horizon. Number 4, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Number 3, Aliens. Number 2, Alien. And number 1, The Thing. That's an incredible list. Absolute wall-to-wall bangers on that list. Like, I think the thing about this subgenre is that the movies are all so much fun. Like, with every single one of those films, I kind of go, ooh, I could actually sit and watch that right now, you know, no matter what mood I'm in. That's the thing. And yeah, I love all of them. You guys have got great taste. Let me just quickly run through some of the honourable mentions, movies that narrowly missed out on making it into your top 10. So I've already mentioned The Endless was the number 11 pick, and that was closely followed by Attack the Block, just missed out on your top 10. From Beyond, the amazing Stuart Gordon film. I'm so glad there was so much love for that. Rocky Horror Picture Show is up there really high, just missed out on the top 10. 10 Cloverfield Lane, They Live, Quatermass and the Pit. A lot of love for Quatermass and the Pit. That was the highest ranked Quatermass movie of the trilogy. Signs, M. Night Shyamalan's Signs was also in that top 20, and so was Invasion of the Body Snatchers 1956, which actually, over on Patreon, when we did the greatest horror movies of all time poll, that actually made it into the top 50, surprisingly. So I was in a way quite surprised that it didn't rank higher up on this list. But there you go, that's it. That's your favourite alien, sci-fi and cosmic horror movies. And very quickly, I won't dwell on these, but I'm going to quickly run through my personal top 10. At number 10, I went with Extro. Just because, come on, Extro. So much fun. My new discovery for the season, and I absolutely loved it. So number 10, Extro. Number 9, I went with James Cameron's Aliens. I've always believed that it is as much a brilliant horror film as it is an action movie. Number 8, I've gone with Signs. I am a big M. Night Shyamalan fanboy, and for me, Signs is one of my favourites. It's spooky and creepy and weird and funny and moving. I love it. My number 7, I've gone with Phantasm. Again, I now have such fond feelings towards the Phantasm franchise as a whole, and I love discussing it with Steph, this series, and yeah, it's really gone up in my estimation. So my number 7, Phantasm. My number 6, I've gone with From Beyond. Again, kind of a perfect movie, I think, and one of the best examples of Lovecraftian cosmic horror on film. I love Stuart Gordon and Brian Usner. I love their aesthetic. I love Bryan Crampton. It's weird, it's sordid, it's a bit naughty, it's a bit sexy, and it's also really gross. Love discussing that movie with Becky Dark. That's my number 6, From Beyond. My number 5, I've gone with Benson and Moorhead's Resolution. It's lesser known than The Endless, but for me, it's actually the better horror film. Number 4, I've gone with The Mist. I mean, come on, it's just the scariest, bleakest thing known to man. At number 3, I've gone with your number 1. My number 3 is John Carpenter's The Thing. I think it is a spectacular film. I basically couldn't fault it. I just personally have 2 other films that I prefer to this one. At number 2, I've gone with Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1978. This was your number 4. And I talked about this again and again, but I just can't get over how well made that film is and how effective it is. I love everything about it, and it really leaves me feeling cold and chilled by the end. It's so masterful. So that's my number 2. And of course, number 1, I've gone with Ridley Scott's Alien. It may not have topped your list, but for me, it's perfect from beginning to end. And as I've mentioned multiple times, it introduced us to the scariest movie monster in cinema history. So my number 1 sci-fi cosmic horror movie of all time, Ridley Scott's Alien. And that's it for this week's episode, and that's it for our 7th series of the podcast. Can you believe it? Thank you so much to all of you for your incredible support as ever throughout this season, for your amazing engagement. I've loved chatting to all of you guys every week on the discussion group about each movie we've covered. I love the community that this podcast has created that is growing and growing with every season. And this has been one of the absolute best and most fun seasons for me so far. So thank you all so much. We are going to be taking a little break now. We won't be back next Friday, but please do stay in touch. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can keep in contact on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And the best way to get in contact with me, if you want to chat about horror movies or anything else, join the discussion group, the Evolution of Horror discussion group. There you can chat about anything podcast related or horror related with me and with fellow listeners. And don't forget, if you want to continue hearing weekly episodes, then just sign up to our Patreon. For $5 per month, you can hear a couple of bonus episodes per month. For $10, you can get a new episode every single week. It'll be like we never went away. You can find this podcast on all the normal podcast places. And this is a really big request that I'm emphasizing more than ever. While we're away, it's really great to get some ratings or reviews on Apple Podcasts, because otherwise our podcast will disappear into obscurity in the sea of other other movie and horror podcasts that pop up with new episodes from week to week. So in order for us to keep getting discovered by new listeners and to keep being able to grow, reviews and ratings are super important. So if you haven't done so already, I'd be so grateful to you if you could drop us a little rating or review, preferably a 5-star one, on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Well, that's it. I guess all that's left for me to do now is to reveal what we're going to be covering in Series 8. So, we will be back in the spring of 2022 to begin our journey on the evolution of vampire movies.
Listen to them. Children of the night. What music they make.
Finally, we're doing vampires. This is a subgenre that we've been talking about doing and people have been asking me about since the podcast began. And for various different reasons, we've put it off. And now is finally the time to do it. So we are going to be covering some absolute classic vampire movies, some of the most iconic movies in the genre's history. We're going to be kicking things off with silent cinema, of course, talking about movies like Nosferatu. We'll then be moving into the 1930s, into the Universal horror movies, Bela Lugosi's Dracula. Then we'll be moving through to the Hammer horror years, and of course discussing Christopher Lee and his Dracula films. We'll then dive into some interesting movies from the 70s, The Vampire Lovers, Twins of Evil, Daughters of Darkness, The Blood-Spattered Bride, Let's Scare Jessica to Death, Martin, Blackula, Ganja and Hess. Some incredible stuff in the 1970s. We'll then move through to the 1980s, where we're going to be covering some of the big, cool, sexy vampire movies, Fright Night, The Hunger, Near Dark, The Lost Boys, into the 1990s when vampire films became starry and glossy, Interview with the Vampire, From Dusk Till Dawn, Blade, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, into the 2000s when vampire films became slightly schmaltzy, the Twilight series, for example, or Let the Right One In, and then we'll be finishing with some modern day masterpieces like A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, Only Lovers Left Alive, and What We Do in the Shadows. There'll be so many more on top of those titles to cover, so I really hope you join me on this incredible journey through the evolution of the vampire movie. So join us again very soon for another episode and another series of the evolution of horror.